The Range Rover's taillights were already shrinking into the dark when Garrett Cole realized she wasn't coming back. No apology, no payment, just the sound of tires on gravel and a man standing alone in a parking lot in Beaumont, Texas, holding an invoice for $199 that nobody was ever going to pay. What Garrett didn't know yet, what he couldn't have known, was that the woman driving away from him was about to walk into her father's house and casually mention his name over dinner. And within 24 hours, that one careless sentence would set off a chain of events that would change his life, his daughter's life, and the entire future of the smallest auto shop on Highway 90. This is the story of how a refusal to pay $199 turned into a check for $99,000. And by the end, you'll understand exactly why some people should be a lot more careful about who they decide isn't worth their respect. If you believe honest work deserves honest pay, you're already going to feel this one. Hit subscribe before we keep going, because where this story ends is not where you think. 11 minutes before closing, the phone rang. Garrett almost let it go to voicemail. His hands were covered in grease. His back ached from being bent over an engine since 7 that morning. And his daughter Danny was already asleep on the couch in the waiting room, a blanket pulled up to her chin. But he picked it up anyway, because that's who he was. The voice on the other end was sharp, clipped, and used to getting what it wanted. A woman's SUV had overheated on I-10. Every shop in Beaumont was closed or booked solid. Could he help her or not? Garrett wiped his hands on a rag and told her to bring it in. He didn't ask her name. He didn't need to. In 3 years of running Garrett's Auto and Tire, he'd never once turned away someone stuck on the side of the road, no matter how late it got or how tired he was. The shop sat on the corner of Highway 90 and Caldwell Road, a squat brick building with a faded sign and a parking lot that buckled in the Texas heat. Inside, there was a folding table, a coffee maker that had survived since 2009, and a hand-painted sign nailed above the register that read, "Honest Work." Fair price. Every time. Garrett meant every word of it. Beaumont wasn't a flashy town. It smelled like diesel and cut grass and the distant salt of the Gulf. Freight trains rattled through at all hours. A high school baseball game played on a radio somewhere down the block. It was the kind of place where people still waved at strangers, and a man's word still meant something. A sharp contrast to the glass towers, sitting an hour down the interstate in Houston, where money moved fast and nobody waved at anybody. Garrett was 36, wide shoulders, tired eyes, the kind of hands that had fixed more engines than he could count. He was also a father, the only parent 7-year-old Danny had left. His wife Leanne had died 18 months earlier. A brain aneurysm. No warning, no goodbye, no final conversation. She'd kissed him on the cheek one morning on her way out the door and was gone by that afternoon. Garrett didn't talk about it much. He'd taken what was left of their savings, the life insurance, and a loan from his late father-in-law, and poured it all into this shop. Not because he wanted to get rich, but because he needed somewhere to stand when the rest of his life had collapsed underneath him. Now Danny slept most nights on that worn-out couch, while her father worked late under somebody else's car. People in Beaumont knew what kind of man Garrett was. The widow 2 streets over who got her brakes fixed for free and never knew why. The teenager he'd quietly taught how to change his own oil so he wouldn't get ripped off elsewhere. The veteran whose truck he repaired and never invoiced. He never posted any of it online. He never used it to get more customers. He just did it, the way some people just breathe. But doing the right thing didn't pay the bills. A corporate chain called SpeedFix had opened 2 locations nearby with leather couches and free Wi-Fi. And Garrett's customer base was thinning out month by month. 3 unopened bills sat on his kitchen counter that very night. This was the man the woman in the Range Rover was about to meet, and the man she was about to badly misjudge. She pulled in at 7:02 p.m., 11 minutes before closing, in a white Range Rover that probably cost more than Garrett's entire building. She was 41, dressed in a blazer, despite the suffocating Texas heat. And she didn't look at Garrett when she got out. She looked at her phone. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask how long it would take. She stood near the vehicle with her arms crossed, scrolling, while Garrett popped the hood and got to work. Her name was Sloane Whitfield, though Garrett wouldn't learn that until much later. She was the founder of a private equity firm in Houston, the kind of woman who was used to people moving out of her way. Garrett worked through what should have been his dinner break. He skipped the call he needed to make about Danny's field trip permission slip. The problem was a cracked coolant hose and a stuck thermostat valve. Nothing exotic, nothing dishonest, just an honest repair done right. By 7:40, the Range Rover was fixed. He walked over, wiped his hands one more time, and handed her the invoice. $199. She looked at the paper the way someone looks at an insult. Her jaw tightened. "You're joking," she said. Garrett wasn't. He walked her through every line item. The OEM hose, the thermostat, 40 minutes of labor. She accused him of price gouging, said she'd had similar work done in Houston for $60. He offered, calmly, to show her the parts he'd pulled out of her own engine. She waved him off like he was something she could simply scroll past. Then she said the sentence that would end up costing her far more than $99. "I don't know what kind of people you're used to dealing with out here," she said, sliding into the driver's seat, "but I'm not one of them." And she drove away without paying a single dollar. Garrett stood in the lot until her taillights disappeared completely. Around him, Beaumont kept humming along the way it always did. A freight train somewhere in the distance. The murmur of that baseball game 2 blocks over. He wasn't angry. He was something heavier than angry. He was just tired. He picked up a sleeping Danny from his mother's house, carried her to the car, and sat with her at the kitchen table once she woke up enough to draw. She handed him a crayon picture of a race car with the words, "For Daddy's shop," scrawled across the hood. He taped it to the refrigerator like it was the only thing keeping the kitchen standing. Then he paid 2 bills online and left 3 more sitting unopened on the counter, because there wasn't enough left to cover them. He didn't know it yet, but 90 minutes away, in a dining room that cost more than his shop and his house combined, his name was about to come up. That night, in the gated quiet of River Oaks, Houston, Sloane Whitfield sat across the dinner table from her father. His name was Robert Whitfield. 70 years old, a self-made logistics billionaire who'd started his career loading cargo trucks in Amarillo at 19. He wore no watch. He drove a 10-year-old Ford F-150 that he refused to trade in. And in 50 years of building an empire, he had never once refused to pay a working man what he was owed. Sloane brought up the mechanic the way someone mentions a delay on the freeway. Casual, forgettable, barely worth a sentence. Robert set down his fork. "Did he fix it correctly?" he asked. "Yes," Sloane said, not even looking up. "Was the price fair?" She paused for half a second too long. I guess. Probably." Robert didn't say anything else. He just sat there, very still, while the temperature in that dining room dropped by about 20 degrees. He stood up from the table without finishing his dinner. He walked into his study, closed the door, and picked up his phone. By morning, he would know everything there was to know about Garrett Cole. And by the time the sun rose over Highway 90, a decision would already be made. One that no algorithm, no invoice, and no apology could ever undo. Robert Whitfield didn't sleep much that night. He started with a single phone call to an old friend who still lived in Beaumont, a man he'd known since his trucking days, back before the money, back when Robert himself still had grease under his own fingernails. The friend didn't even hesitate when Robert asked about Garrett Cole. "Everybody around here knows Garrett," the man said. "You want the long list or the short one?" Robert wanted the long one, so he got it. He learned about the widow on Calder Avenue, whose brakes Garrett had fixed for free, telling her it was a warranty issue, so she wouldn't feel like charity. He learned about the teenager from the apartments behind the Walmart, a kid with no father around, who Garrett had taught to change his own oil on Saturday mornings, free of charge, just so the boy wouldn't get taken advantage of somewhere else. He learned about the veteran's pickup truck Garrett had rebuilt almost entirely from spare parts and never once invoiced, because the man had told Garrett he was 3 months behind on rent, and Garrett had simply said, "Don't worry about it." Robert made 4 more calls after that one. Each call added another name, another story, another small act, that Garrett Cole had never told anyone about, never posted anywhere, never used to build himself up. That detail sat heavier on Robert than anything else. A man with that much decency, struggling to keep the lights on, who could have used any one of those stories to get ahead, and chose not to. Not once. By 2 in the morning, Robert was sitting alone in his study with the lamp on, staring at a yellow legal pad covered in names he'd never met. He thought about his daughter's voice at the dinner table. Casual, untroubled, like she'd done nothing wrong at all. He thought about the company he'd built from nothing, and the one rule he'd never broken in 50 years. You pay people what they're owed, especially the ones with the least power to make you do it. By 5 in the morning, his decision was made. He didn't write it down. He didn't need to. He just waited for the sun to come up over Highway 90. If a story like this means something to you, if you believe a man's character should matter more than his bank account, drop a comment below and let us know. It helps more people find Garrett's story. And trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. Garrett opened the shop at 7 the next morning the same way he opened it every morning. He flipped on the lights, started the old coffee maker, and unlocked the front door before the heat had a chance to fully settle over Beaumont. Danny's crayon drawing was still taped to the refrigerator back at his mother's house, where she'd stayed the night so Garrett could get an early start on a transmission job he was already behind on. He didn't think about the woman in the Range Rover. Not really. People like that came and went. He had bills to think about instead, the 3 sitting unopened on his kitchen counter, and the fact that Speedfix had pulled in 2 more of his regular customers with their free Wi-Fi and their leather couches. He was halfway through draining old transmission fluid when he heard a truck pull into the lot. It wasn't a customer's car. Garrett knew every vehicle that came through his shop, and this wasn't one of them. He wiped his hands and stepped outside to see a 10-year-old Ford F-150. Dusty, plain, nothing special about it at all. Parked right in front of his door, at exactly 7:47 a.m. A man stepped out. 70 years old, maybe. Plain shirt, no watch, boots that had clearly done real work at some point in their life. Garrett didn't recognize him. There was no reason he should have. "You Garrett Cole?" the man asked. "That's me," Garrett said, already reaching for a rag to wipe his hands clean. "What can I help you with?" The man looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that wasn't sizing up a stranger so much as confirming something he already believed. "My name's Robert Whitfield," he said. "I think we need to talk." They sat in Garrett's cramped little office. 2 folding chairs, a desk covered in invoices, the same Mr. Coffee machine humming in the corner. Robert didn't mention his last name's weight. He didn't need to puff himself up. He just sat there like any other man who'd come in for an oil change. Garrett told him about the SUV, about the cracked hose, the stuck thermostat, the itemized invoice, the woman who'd called him a price gouger and driven off without paying. He told it without bitterness, without exaggeration. He didn't even raise his voice when he got to the part where she said she didn't know what kind of people he was used to dealing with. He just told it plain, the way he told most things, like a man reporting the weather. Robert listened to every word without interrupting once. When Garrett finished, Robert sat back in his chair and studied him for a moment. "Why didn't you fight back?" Robert asked. "Send it to collections. Post about it online. Plenty of people would have." Garrett thought about that for a second. "Because Danny's gonna ask me how my day went," he said. "And I want to be able to look her in the eye when I answer." Robert didn't say anything for a long moment. Something in his face shifted. Not surprise, exactly. More like confirmation of something he'd suspected all night, but needed to hear out loud. He reached into his jacket and placed an envelope on the desk between them. Garrett glanced down at it, then back up at Robert. "Look, if this is about the $199, you really didn't need to drive all the way out here for that." "Open it," Robert said. Garrett picked it up slowly, sliding his thumb under the flap, like he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know what was inside. Inside was a single certified check, $99,000. Garrett's hands went still. He read the number twice, then a third time, like the zeros might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. "This isn't charity," Robert said quietly. "This is what your work is actually worth to this community. I just happen to be the one delivering it." Garrett couldn't speak. He looked down at the check, then at his shirt pocket, where a worn, folded crayon drawing of a race car had been sitting since the night before. He'd grabbed it off the fridge that morning without even thinking about why. He looked at it. Then he put his head down and cried, quietly, the way men who don't let themselves cry often very much do, when nobody's supposed to be watching. We're getting close to one of the most powerful moments in this story, and honestly, this is exactly why stories like Garrett's deserve to be told. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You do not want to miss the next chapter of this one. Robert gave him a minute. He didn't rush it, and he didn't look away either. When Garrett finally lifted his head, Robert spoke again, slow and plain, like a man who'd thought about these words for hours and wanted to get them exactly right. The world is full of people who mistake a title for character, he said. My daughter has a title, you have character, and character outlasts everything. Every market, every recession, every bad decision somebody else makes about you. He stood up, extended his hand, and Garrett shook it. Take care of that little girl, Robert said. Then he walked out, climbed back into his Ford F-150, and pulled out onto Highway 90, without a single camera, a single press release, or a single person ever knowing what had just happened inside that small office, except for the two men who were there. Garrett stood in the doorway of his shop for a long time after the truck disappeared down the road, the check still in his hand, the crayon drawing still in his pocket. He thought about Leanne. He thought about the 3 unopened bills on his counter. He thought about the sign on his wall that had never once been a marketing slogan. Honest work, fair price. Every time. For the first time in 18 months, Garrett Cole allowed himself to believe that things were about to change. But what he didn't know yet was that 90 minutes away, in a quiet office in downtown Houston, his name was about to come up again. And this time, it was Sloane who was about to find out exactly what her father thought of what she'd done.